Hey, all. Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I recently attended the Civil War Show in Mansfield, Ohio. It's one of the biggest and very best in the country. If you've not been, imagine walking into a museum of treasures where almost everything is for sale. I go to sell magazines, books. I make scans of old photographs that visitors bring in. And of course, I meet and greet folks and get story ideas. One person I met is a passionate student of the 4th Michigan Infantry. His name is George Wilkinson, and he told me all about his website. George's approach to it is using primary source material to use as much as possible and let the images on the site do the talking along with the primary sources. There's no advertising or sponsorships. It's all paid for on George's own dime. When I got home, I checked out the site, and you can check it out too. It's fourthmichigan.wordpress.com. I have to say, I was impressed. It's packed with letters and photos and all sorts of information related to the 4th. I want to share one of the battle letters. Of course, I went to the battle letters to take a look at those, did some searches for various battles, and wound up doing a search for Fredericksburg. And there I found one by an author, a first lieutenant named William F. Robinson. He was in Company H. He described the fighting and the horrors at Fredericksburg. It's a worthy read, and I want to share it with you. But before I begin, do know that the version has been revised by George ever so slightly to add a few words here and there for clarity and readability. So, here we go. Camp near Falmouth, Virginia, December 18th, 1862. My dear father, I received your letter of the 8th instant yesterday evening, and I was, as usual, glad to hear from home. I wrote you a short note on Monday to let you know that I had passed through the battle and come out all right. Thinking that you would like to know something concerning the battle, I will give you a little idea of it. We left this camp at daybreak Thursday morning, December 11th, and marched to Fredericksburg. Our artillery was on the heights on this side of the river, bombarding the city, and kept up a continual roar of artillery all day until night closed in. We laid down in the mud and went to sleep. 2 companies of the 7th Michigan Infantry crossed in boats and drove the rebel sharpshooters back so that the bridge was able to be laid down. That's a pontoon bridge. Troops were crossing the next day under the cover of our artillery. We still laid back in the mud while troops were crossing very cautiously all night. We were called up at daylight, got our breakfast, expecting to cross immediately, but did not get orders until about noon, Saturday, December 13th. We got across the river about 3 o'clock p.m. and marched up the street and turned onto another that the Rebs had an enfilading fire on, and they just gave it to us hot and heavy. But we still kept on and turned on another street that took us out to the suburbs. There, we were protected by a small bank until that we got into our position. Then came the order to charge the railroad. Our brigade charged and took it. Colonel Schweitzer, who was acting brigadier, started ahead on horseback, swinging his old hat on his sword above his head, saying at the time, "Come on, boys, there is nothing here that will hurt us." And we followed him and took the railroad. He was shot in the leg and had his horse killed. One of his aides was killed, another wounded slightly in 3 different places, and the other had his horse shot under him. Still, the second brigade kept on across an open level plain, exposed to a crossfire of artillery and a front fire of musketry, until we reached a slight rise of ground behind which we lay down and fought until after dark. We were in the right with Sumner, it's General Sumner, and had the hardest fighting to do and lost the most men. Our division alone lost 1,600 killed, wounded, and missing. At night, we lay down with the dead and dying and went to sleep. It was awful. We had left our blankets back in the rear, and to keep warm, the men would find a dead man that was covered up with a blanket, and with one on each side of the dead, spread the blanket over them to keep frost out. I noticed particularly one dead horse that had not yet got cold, covered with men's hands and ears, trying to keep warm. Still, it was done with a good relish. But all that was nothing compared to the groans of the wounded and dying. Their cry was continually, "Water, a little water. Oh, for mercy's sake, come and take me off." And we could not leave our post to help them, as the destiny of the army depended upon our holding this position. The 1st Michigan Infantry was right by us. They lost 7 officers, we only 2. Brent Kennedy, the best one, died the next day. I was down to see him before he died. I believe that he was embalmed and sent home. He was a brave man and feared no danger. I must say that I think we passed under the heaviest fire that I ever saw, and a great deal heavier than I ever wish to see again. The next day was the Sabbath, commonly a day of rest. So, not to break it, we lay on our bellies all day. I must stop now to drink a hot whiskey punch. All right, now, I do not often touch it, but when I do, it being just about this time of day, I thought that I would stop. We were relieved about 9 p.m. and marched back to the city, where we took lodgings. And I will say this, that as much as I have traveled in the last 4 years, that I never before went into a place as large as Fredericksburg and took up lodgings on the sidewalk. But having been on the battlefield 35 hours with very little sleep and no blankets, I must say that I enjoyed my rest hugely. Goodbye to all, from William. It's hard to imagine. It's seared in my brain, the idea that Robinson and his fellow Michiganders would be so frigidly cold on that December night at Fredericksburg, sleeping on the ground, trying to sleep on the ground, surrounded by the cries of the dead and of the dying and wounded men, and trying to keep warm by putting a blanket between dead bodies so they could keep the frost off of them. And then that idea of the horse, the dead horse still warm, and all the soldiers putting their hands and some laying their ears against the animal's body to try to absorb some of that heat. It sends chills through me just thinking about it. Imagine Robinson living with it through the rest of his life. The good news is Robinson survived the cold and horrors, and as a 1st lieutenant, he eventually went on to become the captain of his company. 7 months later at Gettysburg, he suffered a gunshot wound to his upper right thigh during the 2nd day's fight. He resigned on account of that wound and returned home. So there you have the story of William Robinson and the 4th Michigan, with special thanks to George Wilkinson to turn me on to his wonderful website. I'll put the link below so you can check that out. By the way, the original letter is in the collection of the Bentley Historical Library. And one final note, I wasn't able to find a wartime portrait of Robinson. If you have one or know where one is, let me know. Thanks. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.